We have less of a connection than we should, I think, with the various natural resource management groups around the country, partly because I think many of them are a little afraid of lobbying in case they lose their funding. And obviously that's something that we should try to address collectively, because I think unless we get the activism of people such as yourselves who are working in regional Australia, undertaking on-ground, Western Australia, on-ground conservation, then we're not likely to be successful in addressing many of the problems that we confront. So that's a little bit of background about the conservation activity. But I teach psychology to UWA students, and I go wherever I can to talk about the impact of the natural environment on human health. It's not something that people think about very much. They often point to pollution or the absence of pollution as the critical problem, maybe, of so-called ecosystem services, the fact that we need a natural environment to clean the air and water and so on, and we need good soil, all of those things people will probably be aware of. But they're often unaware of the extent to which human beings respond to the natural environment, and where the destruction of the natural environment has severe consequences for human health. I'm going to backtrack a little, and forgive me using my notes here. But I did want to talk a little bit about the wheat belt in particular, because it's where I come from. That's where my roots are. And I don't know exactly when it happened, but I did fall in love with this land. Perhaps it was when, as a little kid, I went picking wildflowers, as many of you have done, with my mother from the great swathes of everlastings that smothered the woodlands of my childhood. Or it might have been when I got the first heady and unforgettable whiff of the coastal heathland on the approach to the boarding school I was exiled to at Dongra. Whenever it happened, that feeling, that attachment, has only grown stronger, and it makes me protective of my country in the broader sense, but particularly this part of the world. And perhaps that's why I'm less than enthusiastic about the siren call of economic growth, in a sense overwhelming everything else. The wanton destruction that occurs, in fact, out of sight of most Australians, because we are now largely urban dwellers, and a lot of people living in the cities don't put their heads up over the ramparts very often to see what's happening in the rest of the country. But any dispassionate assessment of the planet, generally, and the corner of it that we inhabit, shows that we're making one hell of a mess of it. The depletion of our finite resources, the loss of biodiversity, and so on and so on and so on. I won't go through the catalogue because you're all too familiar with it. We're eliminating other species, as you know, at an alarming rate, both plants and animals, and you'd be very familiar with that in this part of the world. We, as George Monbiot puts it, the living world is dying of consumption. That's the underpinning driver. And a little history here is in order of this part of the world. A lot of people came here expecting to make a living and to use the land as a right, with a little regard often for the place or the people who'd been in residence for over 40,000 years or more, and without any apparent consideration of those long-term costs. It was the wholesale clearing of the land here that was, in a sense, the first indication of what was to come. The process of degradation and the disregard for the natural environment was taken up with enthusiasm. It was clearing at any cost. And then, as now, the relationship with the land was really one of power and purpose, and fed by that very European notion of subduing the land to bring it under control, controlling nature. And my own family had a hand in this, clearing and farming the land for generations. They came here in the 1850s, around the northern area. Got tickets of leave and Crown land grants. And a lot of them came without any apparent prospects, and probably without much hope either. There are a few convicts amongst them, more than is perhaps polite. They were extruded from their homes, miserably adrift very often, with no knowledge of this place, and many of them with no skills when it came to agriculture. They eked out a living of kinds, and it was utterly unlike anything they'd encountered before. They didn't know the plants, the animals, the indigenous people. These were people in a strange land. By the time I was growing up on a farm in the marginal wheat belt country of Murrawall, success in farming had come to be equated with clearing as much land as possible. Indeed, the soldier settlers like my father were required to clear a certain percent of the land in order to satisfy the conditions of their farm. And government, over the next 20, 30, 40 years, continued to offer incentives for clearing. And as I say, it was a condition of many of the grants. And early land clearing efforts, as people saw it then, was seen to improve the land, would get better. The quality of the land would be better if you cleared more. Speaking about the clearing of forests in the 1930s, one farmer said, "Ring barking the trees is a process guaranteed to sweeten the soil, improve the quality and quantity of native grasses, and build up the sulks." The opposite, as it happens, is true, as you know. While the WA poet Dorothy Hewitt celebrated a landscape and a way of life which many wheat-built kids like me still hold dear because of her representation of space and life and the land's relentless grasp, she clearly sensed that we were spoiling our heritage and wrote, as she put it, as a whole Noah's Ark of animals, and she's writing here in the 50s and 60s, having been whisked away, and of erosion carving up the land. I saw some of those on TV today, and the white patches of salt, which I also saw, which deadened the paddocks. Her fellow poet, John Kinsella, who you'll hear from today, one of the great wheat-belt poets, tells of helping his uncles and cousins plant trees to try to reclaim the land lost to salinity. John says, "The salt was the poison, the salt was the truth behind it all, and the rich green and yellow and then burnt stubble of crops were only an illusion." Describing two poems she'd written decades apart about the same area, Hewitt observed that while the place was the same, the poem had become a lament. Clearing and overstocking have decimated the fragile earth, and the salt is rising. Now, you're all familiar with these problems. The destruction of the mallee woodlands in Western Australia, about which Kinsella and Hewitt and many others have written, is almost complete, which is why it's so important to protect what's left. We know that this damage has been done. We know it continues to be a problem because the consequences of that clearing are still with us and likely to grow further, which makes it all the more distressing to see continued practices, whether it's about clearing roadside vegetation or clearing of agricultural land, or clearing, in the case of the cities, for urban expansion. Getting rid of our remnant bushland is really something we shouldn't contemplate. It's now well understood, but wasn't when my father was reading through the scrub, as they called it, that native vegetation is crucial to sustaining soil fertility, providing nutrients, regulating salt levels, and so on and so on, when you know the story. But what I want to talk about today, having set that scene, is what we're doing, in a sense, to positively engage people. You're probably familiar with this report, State of the Environment report. If not, it's a brick-sized document, but you can now get it online. And it looks every 5 years at a national level at the state of the environment, including biodiversity, the quality of our soils, water, air. A very important document. Unfortunately, the state of the environment in the state is no longer being recorded, and I hope the present government will at some point reinstate it, because we need to keep track of this. The last State of the Environment report, particularly in relation to species loss and habitat loss, talked about us presiding over managed decline. So we're recording some of it and watching it, but we're not necessarily intervening to reverse it. And rather than having images like this, we have them like this. And like this. Our relationship with the environment is complex, and there are a couple of things that I need to talk about in order to set the scene. One is the whole concept of place attachment, and you're probably familiar with this, in your own hearts and minds. We do become attached to places. We do come to love them, as I said at the outset. And that relationship is one that, when it's broken, has consequences for psychological well-being. It's one of those things that governments in particular don't like to hear about. But when people rise up against the destruction of place, you can see just how strongly they feel about it. In the Perth metropolitan area recently, you would have seen the fight for road protection of a bushland that was to be destroyed by a road highway. And a lot of that was about people's connection with that native vegetation and the place that they grew up and the walks that they took and the children's experience of the place. Sometimes the destruction of place doesn't occur as dramatically as was occurring in that case. It's rather the managed decline, bit by bit by bit. But when people look back over time, and that often includes people who've been exploiting the land, they see that the place has changed underneath their very feet. And Glenn Albrecht coined a word to describe that feeling. He called it solastalgia. What happens when the place you love, you're not away from it, it's not nostalgia, it's disappearing under your feet. And that's what's happening with a lot of the changes in our environments. Place attachment, as I put up there, is important because we know that people who are attached to places, the little bit underneath says, people are more satisfied with their lives, they make better community members generally, they trust people more, they're more likely to get involved in their communities. So we snip these bonds between people and place at our peril. And the attachments are often to a physical environment. We know that people's identity is bound up in that place. You'll hear people talk about where they come from as a way of identifying what it is that they're like. You're invited to think about that relationship. You know, I grew up in the wheat belt. I'm a wheat belt kid. That says something about me in my mind. And similarly, people retain those strong attachments. Sometimes, as I say, with a nostalgic edge, as they see it disappear beneath them. The work that has been done on place attachment shows that those good people who are attached to place are good citizens. The ones who lose that attachment to place are adrift and psychologically unhealthy compared to those who have strong connections. In New South Wales, the coal seam gas and the open cut mining, which is where Albrecht did his initial work, as people saw those horticultural landscapes and the natural landscapes give way to an industrial landscape, increases in alcohol abuse, increases in domestic violence, increases in mental health problems. Something, by the way, that's also been observed very closely in the United States in the coal seam gas mining. I know that's something that's sort of relevant to this area as well, not quite here immediately, but in your general environment. What happens when you cut the top off the hills and you put an industrial landscape over a previously a natural environment is that people respond with great unhappiness. Sometimes they move, but often they stay in place and they're miserable. The other concept is biophilia. So we have a great sense of place, most of us given half a chance to develop it, but we also have an innate predisposition because we grew up, when you think about it, in the natural world, generation after generation. We've been farmers for a relatively short time. City dwellers and people who stare at our screens really for only a generation or two. But we evolved in natural environments with varying degrees of human intervention over many, many generations. And Wilson and others have coined this phrase, biophilia, to capture that idea that we are, by our very natures, connected with the living world. Now, I probably don't need to say that to a group like this, but people often express some surprise. What do you mean, you know, that I might respond to the natural environment, to the animals and plants about me? And I think what you can point to is what happens when you get people to spend time in the natural environment. Take people in a city environment, for example, as in this little study, with children who had cognitive disorders, ADHD, unable to concentrate in the classroom. Something, by the way, I think is overdiagnosed, but nonetheless, that's another question. Children not concentrating in the classroom, not taking part in activities as they might. What happens in many cases is they're medicated. But if you take them out and you walk them in the park, or you walk them in just an urban neighbourhood, or you walk them in downtown, that's a central business district type place, what happens when you measure their performance back in the classroom, the measurement being taken by people who don't know what experience they've had, whether they've been in the park, whether they've been in their neighbourhood, or whether they've been in downtown, the natural environment produces a significant benefit for those children. Better than the pills that they're taking. It is more effective, and that's just a one-off intervention. When you extend that over time, as they've done in various parts of the world, and you systematically measure what happens when children are given more time in the natural environment, these are particularly urban dwellers, but anywhere, you know, town dwellers and country dwellers here, they spend more time in a natural environment, their cognitive development is superior, their mental health is better, their capacity generally is expanded compared to those children who live in more urban and circumscribed environments. Similarly with adults, take city dwellers again, you put them in an environment where they've got access to a green space, a blue space, which is both, as you can see, and an urban environment. And again, these are short-term interventions. They're just simply putting people in a controlled way into these environments, usually for up to half an hour or so, and then measuring them before and after, and again making sure people don't know the people doing measuring don't know which experience they had, so it's not contaminated by expectation. What you find is that their stress hormones go down. The hormones that indicate pleasure go up. People's mood report improves, but importantly, their cognitive performance improves. They're able to do lots of those tricky tests that psychologists impose on them, far better than they are if they're in the urban environment. The combination of blue and green seems to be the best of all, but that gives you an indication of the size of the effect. Blue, green, and then the urban. It's interesting because the studies now, and there are a huge range of these studies, I might tell you, shows that the greater the biodiversity, the bigger the effect. Some of these green environments, so-called, are pretty much just manufactured parks and gardens. But various studies have shown that the more complex the environment, the more biodiversity, the more bird-life in particular in this study, the better the effects, both on mood, stress reduction, and on improvements in cognitive performance. So these are in urban environments where people are deprived. It's hard to get studies in the country environment, but it's pretty clear that, say, town versus country, you'll find similar effects. But generally speaking, children brought up in country environments where they had access to at least some native vegetation, plants and animals, are more likely in the long term to care for the environment. That may not immediately reconcile with your experience, because sometimes people who've been brought up in that mindset of exploiting the land for the benefit of profit may find it difficult to let go of that. But I've been impressed by the fact that a lot of the children of farmers and the grandchildren of those people who cleared the land are now deeply aware of what they need to do to try and recover and to improve the quality. And these are often the best ambassadors for Australia's native vegetation and indeed in other parts of the world. Experience in nature as a child is highly predictive of a willingness to roll up your sleeves and get involved in conservation activities later on, even if it's only through a school-based program, relatively short intervention. The physiological effects of people being in nature, and please tell me when I'm getting close, I don't know where Rachel's gone. Okay. Are very important. The Japanese have a wonderful description of this. They call it forest bathing, Shinrin-yoku. And they actually prescribe it for people with high blood pressure and diabetes. And there have been a series of really excellent studies, controlled studies, comparing people with themselves. You know, what happens when I exercise in a gym or in a place that would put most people to sleep, if not into desperation, versus walking in a forest, the same kind of exercise. The answer is, as indicated on the slide, decreased blood glucose levels in diabetic patients, for example, reduced heart rates, so improved hormonal responses that indicate lower stress levels. Indeed, the World Health Organization now actually recommends increasing urban green space, thinking of the deprivation of our city dwellers, as a public health measure of considerable importance in improving the quality of life, thereby the health of urban populations. The health effects, I'm just going to summarise them because there are many, and a lot of these now actually they map vegetation against other indicators. So there's epidemiological work, as it's called, mapping, for instance, rates of prescription for antidepressant medication with the amount of green in an urban setting, like in the UK. Others have looked at just the distance from green space and health effects. And this is a list. Reductions in reported health problems like heart disease, cancer, reduced levels of obesity, that's obviously probably related to better exercise. People rate their own mental health as better, but there are lower rates of depression. And to sort of flip it the other way, a study here in Western Australia has mapped rates of admission for depression to hospitals in Western Australia with rates of increase in salinity in the wheat belt. Taking account of other things like the economic level, the employment level, the things that might be influencing depression, the relationship is a very tight one. So the more salinity and the more trend towards salinity, the more hospital admissions for depression. And of course, the moderating effects of climate pollution and benefits for health, cleaner air, the sorts of things I mentioned earlier. sorts of things that people don't think about, reductions in rates of preterm birth and low birth weight associated with greener environments, and enhanced cognitive development. And indeed, in people who are getting on a bit like me, rates of dementia decline in green environments. We know it through gardening, of course, but just to finally point to a couple of other effects that people don't think about. There are those individual benefits associated with spending time in a green environment, and they are substantial. They're across populations, but in addition to that, there are social benefits. I mentioned the fact that people who have a strong attachment to place and are able to give expression to their biophilic, if you like, dispositions, tend to be better citizens. Work in Chicago and other places shows that when you green up urban spaces, and the same would be true of country areas, you actually reduce crime rates. And again, these are carefully controlled observational studies. And as you can see, it's not a lot of extra vegetation in those images, it's just a bit of extra vegetation. And you have fewer crime rates overall, you have lower rates of domestic violence, lower rates of violence, fewer children being put into care, and so on and so on. And these are people who all came from the same disadvantaged background. These are the Chicago prospects, so-called. I'm just going to skip over that, say that this is really based on improved social relationships. So contact with the natural environment. I'm just going to use this as the final slide. Faster recovery from surgery, lower crime rates, improved social relationships, improved relaxation, reduced behaviour problems in children, better cognitive performance, reductions in reported health problems, reduced levels of obesity, improved immune functioning, higher self-rated mental health, reduction of the ill effects of pollution, reduction of urban heat island effects, higher productivity, optimised exposure to sunlight, and improved health. And I'm going to leave it there rather than go to the other side, because I don't think there is any argument now that our relationship is a strong one, and we disrupt it, however we disrupt it, at our peril, because the consequences for human health are massive. And when people say to me, oh, I don't understand why levels of anxiety are increasing in our community, I say, well, here's one reason. Because we're busily destroying something that human beings value deep in their souls. Thank you.